I am excited to join you today to talk about our third Wheels Sustainability Benchmark. So today, this morning, we're going to cover just a little bit of background about the survey. I am going to drill in on what we see that's changing, talk about some emerging trends and best practices, and finally share some projections about what we think might be coming next. I do just want to stop for a second and, in this brief session this morning, I'm not going to have a chance to cover all the great insights that are available in the benchmark. I would strongly recommend that you download the full guide and take a look. It is jam-packed with great content, a lot of real-world support on the topics, and you don't want to miss a chance to actually dive in deep. But for this morning, let's get started and just kind of cover some of the background of the folks who responded. I do want to take a second to thank all of our lovely customers who did take time to respond. The information we're able to gather is so valuable. We really appreciate you taking the time to do that. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about the respondents. So you can see in terms of who responded, while the majority were folks who are fleet professionals, there were other kinds of roles that responded to share their feedback in the survey. A great mix of industries. Really excited to see kind of the mix of viewpoints, and it really helps us understand how different industries might be approaching this journey on sustainability. We ask about the size of the fleet that the person manages, and you can see that while most are on the 1,000 or more, there is a good mix of small to mid-range fleets, which again just helps us understand kind of what their motivations are or what some of the challenges might be that they face. And then lastly, we ask about the location of their headquarters. Now, why is this important? We know where most of our clients are headquartered, but why we want to know this is because knowing where that company is headquartered helps us understand how the rest of the organization might be viewing sustainability. So for example, if your headquarters is in Denmark, where 40% of new vehicle sales were plug-in vehicles in 2022, you're going to have a different perspective on some of the challenges and how this can be done, maybe versus a company who's headquartered here in the US. All right, so now that we know who has responded to this survey, what we also wanted to understand was kind of, do you have a goal? What is that goal? What's driving you forward? So we asked our customers if they have a sustainability related goal for the fleet. 58% said yes, we are marching towards a sustainability related goal. Interesting follow-up question we asked this year, and we're going to continue to, I think, iterate on this in future benchmarks, but we wanted to know, of those folks with a goal, who has a reimbursed fleet that they're managing that's also included that goal. And actually 29% of our respondents said, yep, they're responsible for also lowering emissions on a reimbursed fleet. That can be an additional challenge above and beyond the managed fleet, simply because data can be lacking in that space. So if that's a goal, if that's a fleet that is part of your goal, definitely start thinking about how you're going to capture the information related to that fleet. We asked our clients to share what their goals were. You can see a mix. I would say there's kind of two flavors of goals, if you will. One is a carbon emissions-based goal. So we're going to lower emissions by X, or there's more of an inventory-based goal. We're going to change the mix of our fleet from 100% ICE to 50% ICE, 50% electric, something like that. At the end of the day, I imagine all of these goals probably roll up to a higher corporate initiative, and that corporate initiative is probably linked to carbon emissions. So you'll see that come through in some of the topics we cover later. But an interesting mix of goals. One last comment on the goals that was kind of a common factor we saw is the 2030 date. Whether I would say this is kind of a milestone year for a lot of companies in their sustainability journey, whether it's the end of their journey or a major milestone in their journey, 2030 seems to be a year that a lot of people are kind of coming together around. So it seems like it's far away, but it's basically 2024, which means we're almost halfway through the decade, which means we're halfway to 2030. So we better get started if we haven't already. All right, so let's first talk about what we see changing benchmark over benchmark and maybe why we think that's changing. So the first is about where companies are in their sustainability journey. 89% of the fleets who responded said they are already working towards a more sustainable future. So that's a mix of folks who are, kind of in the early stages, actively using solutions at this point. We have seen a significant shift in fleets that are in the process of implementation. So in 2021, 2022, those numbers were around 24%, but this year jumped to 30%. Certainly reflective of the fact that companies are kind of moving through and progressing through their journey. and they're ready to get started. Now, that doesn't mean that the 21% who are actively using solutions, or the 30% who have a strategy in place, or 38% who are in preliminary discussions, that doesn't mean they're 100% electric, right? It just means that they have started on their journey, they have a plan, they have an objective, and they're starting to move towards that. What else are we seeing change? We're seeing a shift in motivation, and this has been really interesting. So environmental stewardship, you can see visually, far and away the leading motivator for companies to make this shift, right? 66% of respondents said, yep, this is why I'm doing this. That number has actually declined fairly significantly since 2021. It was 83% in 2021, 77% in 2022. This year, 66%. If we see a drop to 55% rather, that'll be interesting next year, but all the more reason to do the survey again. At the same time that we're seeing this drop in environmental stewardship as a leading motivator, we're seeing an increase in cost savings as a motivator. So it was 7% in 2021, and now it's 20%. 20% of respondents said this is why we are making this shift. So no matter what the goal is, I think at the end of the day, both are achievable. The cost savings kind of motivator is interesting, right? Because there's a lot of factors at play. Certainly the vehicles themselves right now are more expensive. Those costs should come down as battery technology evolves. We can expect a 30% reduction in maintenance costs, 50% reduction in fuel costs. So overall, the vehicles eventually should be less expensive than their internal combustion engine counterparts. But there's new costs to consider, right? There's infrastructure costs that we need to think about. There's change management costs we need to think about. So depending on what your time horizon is, I think those cost motivators are going to kind of ebb and flow over time. All right, and then lastly, one of the other significant shifts that we're seeing is around public charging. So more and more companies do seem to be offering a kind of managed EV charging program for public charging than when we first launched the survey. As Shlomo mentioned, Jessica Dooley is doing a session later today on public charging. Jessica's from ChargePoint, has some interesting perspectives, so don't want to give too much away. I know she's got a lot of great content to cover, but I certainly think this is a reflection of the maturation of the market, both kind of the fleet space and how we manage this, as well as the public charging ecosystem that we're interacting with. So we're definitely seeing a change here. All right, so we talked about what's changing, but let's talk about what is remaining kind of consistent, which means, and I think 3 years in a row we can say this, I would call it kind of an emerging trend or an emerging best practice, right? These seem to be things that people are coming together around as, yep, this is the way we want to manage these solutions in this new sustainable fleet that we're managing. So the first common area of kind of common responses is around the stakeholders. And I want to call your attention, there's a lot of different colors in this chart, but really want to focus on the fact that the fleet is a huge stakeholder, and then their corporate or executive management is a very interested stakeholder. I do think that just speaks to the fact that we realize these fleet goals that we're all working towards aren't just fleet goals, right? They are goals that we are working towards in service of a higher, corporate objective that benefits everybody. In addition to the key stakeholders who are interested, we're also seeing some commonality among the KPIs we need to report out on. Carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, carbon footprint continues to be the number one thing that people are reporting out on, which again, going back to the goals we saw, that makes a lot of sense. Cost, you can see is also a fairly common metric. Fuel economy, right, that is kind of tied with CO2 and cost as well. But these are certainly KPIs that, we think are important to report out on, and obviously the interested stakeholders have kind of agreed as well for them. The other trend that we're seeing definitely kind of emerge as a common practice is that BEVs, full electric vehicles, appear to be the answer to achieving these sustainability goals that companies have set out. Now, I realize that for some, that seems almost impossible at this point, based on the composition of your fleet or the types of vehicles or the work that the vehicles are doing, right? But as you can see, we do ask respondents kind of tell us, rate these different options to make a more sustainable fleet, right? We know there's not just one way to do it for everybody, but tell me what you think makes the most sense for your fleet. Far and away, companies respond, battery electric vehicles make sense, which again, going back to those goals, if you've got a goal of reducing emissions or zero emissions, you really don't have much choice other than a BEV. Hybrids are a really popular option, but where that kind of causes a bit of a stumbling block is that OEMs aren't really prioritizing hybrid vehicles as an option. Those do make a lot of sense for fleets, but there's not a ton of product out there that you can get your hands on. So I do think BEVs appear to be the way to get more sustainable. All right, and the third kind of emerging best practice we're seeing is we're setting some pretty high expectations for our employees about this switch to sustainability. While these questions here that I'm highlighting on the screen certainly are more aligned with more of a take-home kind of fleet, I don't think the high employee expectations are limited to take-home fleet drivers. I think it's going to be for depot drivers as well. Specifically on the take-home side, you can see companies are investing in helping their employees make this switch. They're providing home chargers, they're providing for installation, they're providing reimbursement for electricity. They're also providing training, support, resources, webcasts, FAQs, training guides, a lot of collateral to help the drivers feel empowered and that they're going to be successful. Similarly, on the depot side, on more of our kind of commercial drivers, I don't think you're going to be able to just throw those folks the keys to an EV and say, go figure it out. I do think there's going to be a lot of support required, and employees are going to come to expect that. So what does that mean for us in the fleet space? One is let's be sure we're proactive about having those tools in place, putting them in our policy, working through our change management strategy. And then also on the other side of the coin, if you're looking to attract and retain talent, having programs that provide that level of support is probably going to be important for your organization going forward. All right, finally, what's changing? What do we think is going to kind of emerge as a new need or a new trend? One is we definitely think depot needs are going to increase. There's increasing regulatory pressure, the Advanced Clean Trucks, the EPA's Clean Trucks plan is focusing on OEMs making and selling more zero-emission vehicles, and we're going to need companies to purchase those vehicles for them to be effective. So we do think there's going to be an increasing need for depots. Patrick Sullivan from EV Realty is joining us later, and he's going to talk a bit about that. Installing a depot can be time and capital intensive, so getting started on those conversations now is something I would recommend all of us do if we haven't already. And then finally, just want to talk about, we do think there's going to be more hands in the pot. One, we've talked about drivers. We haven't had a lot of focus on drivers in the benchmark thus far, something I'd like to maybe add for next year. But I do think drivers are going to become more and more influential as we make this journey forward. And the second group is that I do think that stakeholder group is going to get a little bit more intense as we get closer and closer to our goals, right? When a goal is 10 years out, we're sort of like, okay, we'll get there. As we get closer and closer to that goal, those stakeholders who have a stake in what we're doing are going to get a little bit more intense in making sure that we're on track and we're going to hit those goals as we've said we would. All right, that was a quick run through the environmental sustainability benchmark for 2023. I would strongly recommend that you guys download it. There's so much great content in there, a lot of good real-world insights, and I think some interesting information. If there's anything after reviewing the benchmark that you'd like to see that's not in there, please reach out to me. I'd love your feedback. Love to incorporate additional questions in next year's benchmark to make this even more helpful. And finally, coming soon, we are going to be also publishing an updated EV Readiness Index. Many of you saw our EV Readiness Index last year. It helped provide a clear overview across all 50 states of key factors for electrification, covering topics like legislation, incentives, charger to vehicle ratio, and even climate suitability. So keep your eyes open for that. Should be coming later this year.